make it. And for those of you who've been to the past ones, for joining us through the season. As many of you know, Pi is Peter Ingalls. He's an old friend of many of ours, a founding member of the Telluride Mountain Club and a longtime member of San Miguel Search and Rescue and Telluride Ski Patrol. Great friend to many. And we do these chats in his name. And we also, we do educational outreach. We have scholarships that we offer in the fall. Check the Mountain Club website if you're interested in that. And we sponsor these chats. We look forward to a full season of meeting in person next year. Before I continue, I would like to acknowledge the fact that yesterday was Pi Day and March 14th. We had a very large storm in Telluride. We wound up with 30 inches snow total and nearly 2 inches in water. And for us in 48 hours, that's a pretty big dump, especially the night before last, we had 2 to 4 inches forecast. We got 19 overnight. So we spent a lot of time up on the hill yesterday. I'm sorry, I haven't introduced myself. I'm John Tuckman from the ski resort, snow safety director here in Telluride. We spent a lot of time up on the hill thanking Pi and alternately cursing him for the snow that he and others brought us, and the luck he was bringing us in dealing with it. So anyway, without further ado, let's continue. And before we do, we need to thank our sponsors for these chats, the Telluride Mountain Club, the Telluride Mountain Guides, Mountain Trip, San Juan Outdoor Adventures, and Telluride Helitrax. Now we're going to hear from Matt Steen, who's the Snow Safety Director at Telluride Helitrax. And thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks for working so hard on getting the mountain open. I know it's a lot of work, and people love powder, and so chomping. So good deal. Thank you, everyone, for joining. My name is Matt Steen. I'm the Snow Safety Director with Telluride Helitrax, and been helping with the Pi Avalanche Education Fund for the past couple of years, like John. And we're just here to keep the spirit alive of what Pi used to do, and giving chats throughout the season. And so we're happy to bring an old friend of mine, Jayson Simon Jones, to the Zoom meeting here. And I'm just going to kind of introduce him here, but Jayson's a IFMGA mountain guide based in Colorado. He's been a backcountry ski guide, avalanche forecaster, and avalanche course educator, ski patroller, snowcat ski guide, and avalanche consultant throughout the scope of his career over the past 20 plus years. These days, he is balancing the new frontiers of working as a mountain guide amidst the global pandemic and a sketchy Colorado snowpack year with graduate studies in group communication and development strategies. He's hoping to add value to the conversation around increased decision-making tactics and theories in a high-risk, high-consequence environment. So we welcome Jayson to the Pi Chat. So thank you, and if you're all set, we'll pass it over to you, and you can take over the screen.
Great. Well, thanks, John and Matt, for having me. I really appreciate being here. And let's see here. Let's see. Can you guys see that there?
Yep, yeah. We can. Yep.
Great. I just put together kind of a short presentation on some tactics for better decision-making through communication strategies. And this kind of talk, it came to me. It's actually going to be an article in the upcoming Avalanche Review, the March-April TAR. That's usually human factors based. But having spent a lot of time in the backcountry, both in a professional context as a guide or ski patroller, an avalanche forecaster, as well as like an educator in the recreational realm of avalanche courses, and more recently the professional realm. I've been most recently in a graduate studies program around communication, and I couldn't help but just kind of see all the things that I've been exposed to and learning in the context or framework of what we do in the backcountry in avalanche terrain to make decisions. So throughout the last couple months, as I've been doing that, I kind of came up with this really simple kind of talk, because I found there's some tools there that I thought would be really helpful. I found they're really helpful for me in my own kind of decision-making process with other peers of mine and friends, as well as I thought, maybe there's some things here that could be brought to the greater backcountry community, both in a professional realm, operational context, as well as a recreational context, to help people make better decisions. Because ultimately that's what we're kind of trying to do out there. We're always faced with decision-making situations, and we want to make the best ones possible. Nothing in here is groundbreaking by any means, but I did think that maybe some of this is framed in a little bit of a different context than we're used to seeing in the avalanche world. So to start off with a little bit of history, way back when, in the beginning of decision-making science, there was a saying that ancient Persians made big decisions by discussing them twice. They would discuss them once while they're drunk, and then once again while they're sober. And if it still seemed like a good idea when they were sober, then they would make their decision. Obviously for us, thankfully that process has evolved a bit over the centuries, and as well as both professional backcountry users and recreationalists. That's not exactly appropriate. So we have a bit more of an evolved decision-making process, either in like a formal morning meeting context, or just checking in with our friends before we head out in the field there. But what I want to introduce is a couple communication tools for both professional avalanche workers and recreationalists alike, to hopefully help make some better decisions, or at least be able to evaluate the decision-making process that's going on. So we want to use this communication for better decision-making. Because the backcountry skiing game, it's kind of like playing chess in some regard. We have to make decisions against an opponent that is both dynamic, that's the snowpack environment, and uncertain in the snowpack. So we're always trying to think a couple moves ahead. And the reason why I like to think of it more like chess is that successful chess players think many moves ahead. And that's kind of what we have to think of in the backcountry a lot when we're making decisions. We're gaining information from the avalanche reports, we're talking to other professionals out there, we're looking at observations, we're tracking the weather, we're out in the field, we're gaining obs. But we're always kind of putting that stuff into context for us in regards to what decisions we're going to make today, but also what decisions we're going to make tomorrow or the next day, if we're opening or closing terrain on the ski resort, or choosing what runs to go ski. Really being able to think like a chess player, multiple moves ahead, is what's so key to us being able to make the correct decisions. And if we're just making decisions on what's right in front of us, we're going to miss some pieces of information and get ourselves in trouble. So thinking like chess versus checkers. And the way we do this is a lot of through communication and teamwork. It's the best tool that we have to get as much information as possible about what our best chess move should be next and what those consequences might be. So that means like gathering a bunch of information. Teamwork might be, the ski patrol out there gathering obs when they're trying to open terrain or close terrain and seeing what the winds have done, what the snowfall's done. For just backcountry recreationalists, it might be talking to other people that were out there, knowing what conditions were, and trying to get as much information as possible. So then when we make our move about what we want to go do our decision as informed as it can be, hopefully. The more our team's gathering this information and communicating it, the more likely we're going to make the best move and ski the best slope for those conditions, go to the best place, allow us the best opportunity for what conditions are. However, for this to be the case, communication does not always go well, as we know. Most avalanche accidents and accidents in the mountains in general, if you read back through any of the archives, a lot of them come down to communication. Either people weren't communicating information amongst their team or their partners well, or they weren't gathering it correctly or processing it correctly. So we talk a ton about communication being such an important piece of the puzzle, but sometimes we just think it will inherently come easily to us if we know what the tools are, and then we can just implement them. And we kind of think of communication and the human decision-making process as a system of skills or tools, the same as putting your skins on, buckling your boots, all that kind of stuff, where it's like you just do it and it happens correctly. But unfortunately, human dynamics don't allow for that to happen. And a lot of times this communication and decision-making process can go way off the rails because we can fall into a lot of unconscious kind of psychological traps or biases. So I think it's really important to kind of understand what those are. And what's helped me now is kind of understanding what types of like decision-making and communication traps people fall into, and teams, especially either teams of friends skiing with or professional teams. Because then if you're a little bit more aware and open to that, you can kind of see the process happening and try to get things back on the rails. So about 20 years ago, there was some pretty seminal research that was done, and they did it a lot in the business context, but then it's broadened since then. But they found that there were certain pieces of the equation that lent itself to groups of people making good decisions, and other things that were patterns that were leading to groups of people making bad decisions. And this is across nonprofit sectors, humanitarian sectors, military sectors, athletic endeavors, business endeavors, all that kind of stuff. They found that there were some themes there. So the first thing I want to point out is what those themes were for bad decision making, and to be aware of what they are and how we can fall into them and how they can play into our biases, and then talk about how we can avoid those and what we can do. And then therefore, hopefully, when we're trying to communicate amongst our partners or our team of avalanche workers, we can be aware and heightened awareness to what the process is that's happening amongst the whole communication of the team, especially throughout a season as things go on. So what these 6 traps are, and again, none of these I think are groundbreaking for us, but they do I think have a very important context in the avalanche game. The first one being anchoring. And what that means is putting an uneven amount of weight to the first piece of evidence or data or information that's gathered. So if it's looking at the avalanche report and seeing what the danger rating is, and then that might be the anchoring for someone's decision-making that day. They open the avalanche report first thing in the morning, they see it's moderate, they haven't even looked outside yet, it's still dark. And they tend to anchor a lot of weight to what the danger is and then make a lot of decisions off of that. So being aware that sometimes we can be anchored into whatever that first piece of information is that we gather, that we tend to weight it unevenly, much heavier than other pieces of information. And as I point these things out, I would ask you guys that are listening and tuning in here to maybe like just in your own mind see how these processes have played out in your experience, and if they have or not, if you've experienced these. The status quo is another one that they found leads to kind of poor decision making, and the reason for that being is that a lot of times innovation on what the best process should be is usually based on how things were done previously. One example of that that's kind of widely known is when newspapers went online and away from like print newspaper. Their online format looked exactly the same as a printed newspaper. And that was kind of the status quo of what everyone expected a newspaper to look like. But it didn't necessarily fit the best way for a newspaper to be read online, for example. And obviously that's changed now over the years with clicks and different drop-down menus and things like that. But in the beginning, it was just basically a picture of a printed newspaper on the World Wide Web. And that kind of showed an example of like how status quo there was actually working against an innovative process and keeping the decision-making process kind of hindered in the past. Sunk costs is a big one. I've found myself doing this a lot throughout my career. I'm sure a lot of other avalanche professionals and mountain professionals as well too. But what the sunk cost theory is basically like a justification of your past choices, where you are in a position where you are refusing to kind of abandon a decision-making process because you've put so much time and energy into it to start with. A lot of people think of this financially with the stock market, for example. They might just continue to plug money in there because they've already invested so much time and energy. Or maybe it's a vehicle. Got an old Volkswagen van. I love the thing, but man, sometimes it becomes a sunk cost where I just keep putting money in it and I'm justifying my past choice to have this thing and to continue to keep it. And it's not necessarily making for good decisions. So being aware in the decision-making process, if you are stuck in this phase of just making decisions because you're trying to justify the past decisions you made, instead of admitting that maybe previous decisions weren't good and you need to just scrap the entire process and start over. The big one that we probably all run into the most in the backcountry scenario is the confirming evidence trap. So seeking out info that supports our bias of how we think. So if we really want to open terrain, we will try to find evidence a lot of times that confirms our decision or our suspicion. If we really feel like a slope is safe to ski, we will trend towards confirming evidence to find and just kind of justify our decision-making process. So this one's kind of a no-brainer that we've all been there before, but just realizing how in the end, this was on a global scale, one of the trends they found that led to poor decision-making. Framing is the fifth one. So establishing the context to the problem. So again, an example of framing, and this one can be quite subtle, might be a morning meeting at a ski patrol or a morning meeting at a guide service, and the lead guide or whoever's in charge of the day might frame the day as, we need to get this terrain open. And then all of a sudden the whole day has been framed in that context, and then all the evidence that's being sought out, maybe some of the information and the data all tends to be weighted a little bit towards how that was framed, as opposed to maybe a different way it could have been framed is like, we got a bunch of snow overnight, 2 inches of water. Let's see what we find out there, with no pressure necessarily to open or close terrain. It might be a different way of framing. This is a really difficult one that can happen quite subtly as well too. And again, it might be like, hey, we're going to go ski in Ophir tomorrow. And then it just kind of frames that we're going skiing in Ophir somewhere, as opposed to let's wake up and see what conditions are out there and then decide what's best to do. So beware how framing can kind of influence your decision-making process. And then lastly, the last one they found was forecasting. And basically that it's really difficult for us as humans to assess probabilities when there's a lot of uncertainty, and that we tend to gravitate a lot to our forecast and not take in new information that might tell us our forecasts are wrong. And that we tend to just stay biased on what we think is going to happen and what we've spent a lot of energy towards. In the avalanche world, luckily, a lot of times, especially at avalanche forecast centers, we do have data records to let us know how well the forecasting has been working to refer back to. But a lot of times as recreational backcountry users, we don't really have a good data set to understand what was correct for our forecast and what wasn't, unless we're tracking it ourselves. So the scary thing about all these is then they can all be interdependent and they all feed into one another. So to be really careful that like one of these, the forecasting can feed into the confirming evidence, can feed into the sunk costs, the framing can feed into the status quo. So this is all kind of like a negative feedback loop, and something to really be wary of. So what do we do about this? Hopefully some of those things resonated with folks and they seem pretty common. And how do we kind of like short circuit this process to use communication to make better decisions? And we need to think of decision making as a communication process and not an event. And the way we do that is kind of recognizing there's two different ways that communication can happen, either through advocacy or inquiry. And we want to really focus on the fact it's a process and not an event. So advocacy might look something like this, where we are trying to suppress dissent and basically convince people of our viewpoint. And we tend to then communicate as an event. One place that I have experienced this a ton was when I was a ski patroller, and people felt really strongly about why terrain should be opened or closed. And they would kind of take an advocacy standpoint there and just communicate more and more information and data that was just reinforcing the position that they had. So they were becoming an advocate for either closing terrain or opening terrain, and therefore using all the information they can find to back up their decision. And that's okay, but it's not the best way actually that teams go about making having communication to make decisions. And it's very answers based, like I think we should do this because of all these reasons, and therefore it's the correct answer. And it tends to communicate as an event. As I'm advocating for something, I'm kind of giving my rationale, and then I am done with that. It leads to, research has shown that communicating from a place of advocacy leads to those 6 hidden traps that I just went through. On the flip side of that is inquiry. And what inquiry is a little bit more of a question-based process that's more open-minded and not rooted in one decision or another. So it encourages different perspectives and looks at communication more as a process as opposed to an event. And therefore, like, it's going to happen ongoing, and there might be certain like touchstones along that process, like a morning meeting where you decide to open or close terrain, but then the communication process is still happening throughout the day. Or if you choose to go ski a slope or not ski a slope, but again, the process continues to happen on why those decisions were made, what kind of feedback you could get from it, things like that. It's a very question-based way to communicate with folks. And the idea is it helps us make more good decisions more often. So what does inquiry look like in action? It tends to communicate from a place of multiple alternatives. So throwing out there many ideas in relation to other ideas. So not just having an A and B, and open or close, a ski or run or don't ski or run, but having many different ideas there that hopefully can all be evenly weighted. Testing our assumptions, so gathering data and evidence to revisit what we already thought. So again, a lot of times we get information and we go out there and find some evidence and data to help us decide if we want to ski a slope or not ski a slope, or where we want to go touring or opening or closing terrain, any of those things. And we then need to assumption test and then keep revisiting if that was a good idea or not a good idea, and why. And having different people in the group share the different burdens of assumption testing. Having some well-defined criteria, so standards by which ideas are assessed. So, in the avalanche world, obviously we talk a ton about like snowpack and avalanche and terrain and weather and things like that. They're very well-defined criteria that we make our decisions around. Dissent and debate, so debating alternatives. And really, this is a huge one with a team, and I think this can be a really hard one. Some teams are better at this than others, but really trying to foster an era of communication where teams can rip down and tear apart and debate each other's information or thoughts or ideas, but do it in a way that's non-personalizing and where people feel safe to debate and people don't take it personally. I think my experience on ski patrols is this can be, or in mechanized guiding operations, is this can be quite tricky when you're the new guy. Or if you're a new person in the backcountry ski community and you're going out with some longtime locals that are pretty experienced, the whole dissent and debate is kind of a tricky one because you don't want to stand up. You maybe don't want to like have your voice be heard. You might not be super confident you know as much. But it is an important context there to really make sure the best alternative is coming about. And then the last one is the perception of fairness. And this one is really interesting to me. And what they've found with high performing teams throughout multiple industries globally is the dissent and debate and all these and the multiple alternatives and assumptions. All this stuff works if the team members feel that the process for coming to a final decision is fair. And therefore people will accept the decision, even if it's not their decision, but it's the best decision for the group or the operation. And that the process of how it got there was a fair process. It shows that they're willing to accept that. It's when people feel the process was not fair, that it was weighted to people that had more experience having a louder voice, or people that had been around longer having more sway, that process starts to degrade a little bit, and therefore that perception of fairness starts to disappear. And then all of a sudden it makes it harder for people to kind of get on board and not kind of personalize things. So inquiry is definitely more effective than advocacy. And you know, the biggest thing about inquiry is it's kind of like a collective. So the biggest thing from an inquiry standpoint, where you're trying to make decisions as a group that are well thought out, is that everybody has ownership of the final decision. Where in an advocacy standpoint, a lot of times it's whoever was advocating the loudest with the most amount of evidence and data and information to sway the rest of the group. It's a little bit of a contest. And then they kind of reap the most weight on their shoulders afterwards, where with inquiry, what we're going for is it's kind of a collective. We all share in the final decision-making process and outcome. So just to review some of this stuff, effective decision-making is a product of effective communication. Really to think about decision-making and communication as a process and not an event, a one-time thing. Realizing how being an advocate of something can lead to some of those hidden traps we talked about, like anchoring or status quo or confirmation bias. And then really trying hard to use the process of inquiry to help guide towards more good decisions more often. So having even voices, making sure everybody's voices are heard, having a process that's fair, having very clear criteria on how decisions are being made for the team at hand. And here's just a couple references for some more reading about decision-making traps and things like that. But that's kind of the quick and dirty there on group communication and decision-making for the avalanche world.
Nice, Jayson.
Thanks for that. That was awesome. Just a general for those that are on, you can ask questions. We have a question and answer or a chat. You guys can post anything to the Zoom platform. I had a question for you, Jayson. So
Yeah.
let's see here. I'm trying to like put myself. I mean, I work in a professional setting, so we get to like all this stuff is like set up and framed for us, and I frame it for our guides and everything, and every day is a little bit different, and so we discuss issues or like what you were saying, opening or closing runs and getting group consensus and whatnot. How would you address like I'm trying to reference something back to Telluride, and Telluride has these backcountry gates that are like easy access. So let's just say you're up there and one of your friends comes by and is like, hey, we're gonna go ski the whatever run. How would you address like a quick and hasty scenario like that with like you're making like just like a quick decision, like especially for this side country or backcountry, easy access backcountry, you know, you might be up on the mountain, like you're making the decision in the morning, like, am I going to take my backpack with rescue gear and an avalanche transceiver today or not? And I guess like there's these personal decisions that you might be going through, but then all of a sudden you're like standing there at a gate or you run into someone in a lift line. And now all of a sudden you have to start processing the stuff almost immediately. And or like maybe even deciding before you leave, if I'm going to take my backpack with me with all my gear, you know, I might do XYZ, but I'm not going to do ABC. And like what's your 2 cents on that kind of quick process?
I think that's a really hard process to get right a lot. That's my thought off the top of my head. I think that I've definitely been there and done it myself as well. But I think because it's such a quick decision-making process and there's so many factors and uncertainties there that you're probably falling into one of those traps in regards to like confirming evidence or anchoring or one of those things. And it's probably not a like sustainable process to have, that if you're always kind of making decisions that quickly that aren't that well thought out and researched, you're going to end up getting yourself in trouble. And I think that like, the whole framing thing is like, I've been there too. That's what I'm racking my brain for. Like you frame yourself in the morning of like, I'm just going to take my stuff and kind of see what options are out there. And then all of a sudden it's like you force yourself to make decisions quickly, which is, it's a really challenging thing in our game where there's like so many uncertainties out there and things change so much. You know, it's why I think this season has been a great example of that in some regard, of like all the close calls and avalanche accidents we've had around the state because of it. So I don't have a great answer,
Right.
except
No,
to just,
I mean, yeah, it's kind of like a loaded question. I mean, because it's a tough place to be in, but it's something that everyone should just at least exercise in your head because, you know, that there are these like methodical ways to think through something, and that if you're put in a scenario, either give yourself a wide margin of safety, and you know, try to play conservative, but yeah. We get sucked into these traps, and it's literally they're traps, you know, but just being aware of them and all these points you're bringing up. So, I mean, thank you. It's just, I think the more we talk about it, and the more we're aware of it, the more we can see it.
Yeah. The thing that's difficult, I find in like the professional avalanche world is we're always under such a time crunch to make decisions. It's like your morning meeting or whatever. It's like, like we have that whole timing piece there. Like we have to make pretty critical decisions in the morning, and it doesn't allow some of this process. Like this inquiry process is much slower and more organic. And that's why I think it can be really hard to implement in our world. And maybe part of that process comes outside of operating hours, like a weekly meeting or something to kind of stand back where everyone gets an equal voice to kind of talk about stuff. It's like a weekly guide meeting or something like that. Because I think to implement it in the rush of a morning meeting to get terrain open or go anywhere would be quite difficult to do for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, even in organized settings, it's hard to get, like you always just want to talk about more details of the day and what terrain details, snow details, weather details.
Yeah.
Chuckman, are you getting the question and answer?
I am. I have a question too, but first there's a question from Ryan Howe, our good friend Howdy. Thanks,
Howdy.
Ryan. What are your thoughts on the value of third-party review or no consequence audit to help organization break old insular operational habits, or possibly in-house review and audit?
Yeah, Howdy, that's a great question. I mean, I think an outside external review with no consequences, that's always kind of a good idea. I think to have people come look at the way things are done from a totally objective and non-biased perspective there. I think it's really valuable. I think what can be quite tricky is the auditor definitely has to they have to be respected, I guess, and like kind of be bought into whatever the culture is they're coming in to audit. I think about like when I used to work at Outward Bound, and Matt, maybe you remember this too. Sometimes we'd have like the safety guy come from like the office in Denver on a course and just kind of like give his audit there. And it always felt like he was a little out of touch with what was really happening, and therefore it was not received super well. I've been in other places where on ski patrol, like Colin Zacharias from the Canadian Mountain Guide Association, and has come in, a pretty well-respected avalanche professional, heli guide, and it was just more, he brought a lot of value there, and therefore it kind of bought into the culture a little bit better. So I think there's a great opportunity for processes to be looked at and evaluated in a new light and unbiased. But I think it has to be done by the right people, I guess, that understand the culture of the process there too.
Yeah, I like the concept. Howdy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it does happen, but kind of not that often. And
Well, I mean, unfortunately, the times that I think you see that stuff happen most is after incidents, and you
Right.
get, that's when people are like, oh, wow, we have to look at what we're doing and bring somebody in. And I think, it, like you were saying with Colin, it works as like if it's like a peer review kind of thing. um I think it can be pretty value added for sure. you know proactive is good.
Yeah, not reactionary.
um the question that I have, which is it's a little more general and broad based, and it's not I mean, nobody here, I don't think, is like a professional communications expert or psych or anything like that, but it's something I like to talk about with people in our game, and it's about more about communication than about some of these kind of like bigger anchoring type issues. But it's basic, and it's whether professionals, recreationalists, and how do you make sure or feel good that the people that you're communicating with are actually understanding what it is you're saying, not like that you're not copacetic in communicating, but like, we kind of have these generally understood terms, like, and I'm not talking about danger ratings, but more like you can talk about mindsets or probabilities or whatever. And it's kind of generally accepted, but, everybody's kind of got a different interpretation of these things that we all kind of use as our common touchstones. And so, whether you're out like on a tour and just trying to continually assess, or whether you're in a more formal professional setting, like how do you feel good about making sure that, like, when you're using 2 or 3 words or sentences, that like everybody's kind of hearing the same thing? Does that make sense?
Um,
Because this is something that happens I see it all the time.
yeah, I think that's a great question. I see it a lot too. We see it in the guiding context quite a bit. I especially find it a lot in Europe when I'm guiding over there, how just like different cultures almost referring to different ways of doing things or whatnot, communicating or taken totally differently. And man, I'm definitely no communication PhD expert. In regards to that, I think it's a really interesting question there. And I think in a backcountry touring partner situation, it's probably folks that we have known for a while maybe and communicate with, and therefore we know that how we communicate with one another and how we interpret things on a more broad based, like friendship basis as well too. I think operationally as a team, it becomes much more difficult for sure, especially when you have patrols of 20, 30 people or more, making sure everyone's on the same page. And man, the only thing I can think of things like having internal in-house, communication trainings to make sure everyone's like on the same page of what people mean when they're referring to certain things that they're seeing in the field out there, and that everyone's got the definitions of stuff correct there. I've been finding a lot teaching lately in the pro avalanche course world that's like a big part of what that course is kind of based around now, is that like everyone's communicating the same information from the same place, and they all understand that it all means the same thing. And that's kind of where that world seems to have gravitated, just for that reason, is that like getting everyone speaking the same language. It's such a cultural thing, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it is a tough one. And yeah, I think trying to keep it as simple as possible, like whenever possible, is helpful. But yeah, I mean, a lot of it I think comes down to, like, in a professional setting, certainly with like education and then continuing education, because that's what, you see people who've been doing things for a long time, and they can kind of drift away from the center of the meanings of things.
Yep.
To add a couple things there, I was just thinking like, some, words have weight and meaning to them. And, someone who might think that there's, added terminology to a word, someone else might not understand that. So just being as clear as possible, or if it's boiling down to talking specifics about a ski run and you point out a wind drift or something, or in the morning saying, let's stay away from steep slopes, or you're generalizing or whatever, but like getting to specifics and actually pointing things out and being like, no, that steep slope over there, or that wind drift over there, or whatever, and just clarifying, because communication typically is where things are tripped up, where someone means something and someone else doesn't really pick up what someone else is trying to put down.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point, Matt.
But we talk, especially in the professional world, we talk so much about communication. I really appreciate, Jayson, what you had to say about some of these traps, that I think we've all definitely seen. And I think that one of the big ones that is really communication adjacent is information and processing information. Like the gathering is what we do all the time. We talk about it. You talk about it as backcountry recreationalists, and you talk about it as professionals. But it's really like, what does it all mean? And ultimately, how does it help me reduce my uncertainty? And and I, again, that kind of goes to education and knowing what you're looking at. Which is, again, in a group setting, that's tough because not everybody processes information the same way, and not everybody processes effectively. And there has to be a way for a fair group to balance that, right? To let somebody be heard, but have a way of helping the group deal with information, help the person process the information more effectively in a friendly way, or let the group take the information as a group piece of information and then process it effectively. Or I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, it's like really interesting, the whole idea of like the advocacy and inquiry thing in regards to the processing of information for like decisions. There's probably the famous example of that was during JFK he was faced with both the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the Bay of Pigs invasion went kind of horribly wrong. And they attributed that to the fact that there was like the CIA had kind of filtered the information they were giving, and like really felt that there was one course of action there, and was like filtering information and kind of delivering it in a form of advocacy, like this is why this is the right thing to do, and it went horribly wrong. And Kennedy realized that, and then what he did was the next time when the missile crisis came around was he got all the same people together and he put them in kind of subgroups, and it's just like didn't frame anything for him. It was just like, what do we do? And these different subgroups basically had to just the best option was, without being leaning towards one option or another option. And they all went back and forth, and then they traded options amongst his different subgroups. And he stepped away from the picture actually. And they went back and forth with this like process of dissent and debate and looking at one another's options and tearing them apart and this and that. And then finally kind of came to a decision and presented it to him. And that one tended to work out okay. And that's like a lot of the examples that scholars use on the differences of that stuff. And I just think it's hard in our context professionally, because we have like the time crunch, so to speak. And it's like a stressful environment too. It's like, you're out in the cold, and it's just like, you don't really have these like nice, calm, clear headed opportunities to discuss this stuff in a boardroom somewhere. It's done in a patrol shack or out on a route or in the backcountry on the skin track. And we always kind of have that element. And I don't know if we can eliminate it, but I think being aware of how that plays into the communication process and how it can affect how different people take in information is a big part of it. And I found for me, what's been helpful is trainings outside of the context of the field with the same teams have been pretty helpful for me. Like I said, even if it's like a meeting once a week or once a month, where all of a sudden I was like discussing everything over beers or pizza with folks not in the field about how processes were going, and like continuously revisiting the process throughout the season to kind of see if we were falling into those traps or things like that, to be one answer, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Like beyond just kind of debrief, but like just like a re-examination of the process itself.
Yeah, exactly. When I was working at Irwin, I know it seemed like once a month or maybe even once every 3 weeks, there would be like a big kind of guides operations meeting over like pizza and beer. And everyone would kind of like show up and then just like, yeah, like kind of reevaluate how things were going at like kind of almost like a halftime in the season, where there wasn't necessarily like a bias or an agenda from the day or something like that as one option, I guess. But it's hard for sure.
Pizza and beer, who doesn't like that? Well, thanks, Jayson. There's no other questions that came up, so yeah, I really appreciate everyone joining us today. And Tuck, would you mind just going over those sponsors again? I don't have the list in front of me, but thanks again, Jayson. Really appreciate it.
Thanks. That was great.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. Appreciate it.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that analogy too with the Bay of Pigs and Cuban Missile Crisis. I never heard that one. Yeah, and thanks everybody for attending. Appreciate it. Last backcountry chat of the season, and have a great rest of the ski season if you're in Telluride, and enjoy the spring backcountry skiing. Given the snow we've been getting, hopefully we'll have a good spring up here. And again, we need to thank our sponsors, Telluride Mountain Guides, Mountain Trip, San Juan Outdoor Adventures, and Telluride Helitrax. And thanks to everybody again. And thank you, Jayson. Thanks, Matt. And thanks to Heidi Lauterbach, who keeps us all on the rails with these chats.
Yeah,
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Howdy.
Thanks, you guys. Cheers.
Take care.
Be safe.